Good afternoon, everybody. And given that not everybody has been intimately involved with the KEF, we wanted to just do a bit of quick background. And I think the first thing to say, this is a long journey, actually. It started back in 2017 when the then Minister for Higher Education, Boris Johnson's brother, Joe, announced the idea of having a KEF. And the aim was to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the use of public funding for knowledge exchange and to cultivate continuous improvement. So a sort of balance of kind of accountability and improvement. And the idea was that there would be 7 perspectives, and they're listed on the screen: the research partnerships, working with business, public and third sector, skills, enterprise and entrepreneurship, IP, commercialization, local growth and regeneration, and very pleasingly, public and community engagement built in as one of the 7 pillars of the approach. And the next slide sort of shows just a little bit about the journey. I mean, it has been a journey since 2017. And I think one of the really nice things has been how open that journey has been. There's been consultation, there's been piloting. And in the early days, the whole point of the KEF was it was to be a really light touch process, an absolute minimum of burden. And the idea was that for each of the 7 perspectives, there would be existing data that could just be pulled off, and the KEF could be literally a kind of representation of that data. The suggestion for public and community engagement was that data could be pulled from a survey called the Higher Education Business and Community Interaction Survey, which universities regularly complete. And as part of that, they submit data about the number of public events that they've run, perhaps public lectures, exhibitions, work in museums, and sort of performance. And I think it was quite quickly felt by the sector that actually just wasn't adequate. It wasn't a good way of actually reflecting the practices of public and community engagement. And so through the consultation, I think people moved on from that idea. And the same was felt for local growth and regeneration, that there just weren't good enough metrics. There were some that people felt were kind of okay, but for both local growth and for public and community engagement, the decision was taken by Research England to invite narratives. And this is the template for the public and community engagement narrative: 5 aspects, each looking at a different area: strategy, the support that's on offer, a flavour of the activities, and then 2 aspects looking at the evaluation and the kind of reflective practice. You'll also notice along the bottom of the screen that for public and community engagement, the idea was to invite universities to self-assess and actually, against the criteria spelled out in the guidance, to rate their work between 1 and 5. And the scale is explained on this slide, from a 1, which is the planning phase with nothing yet in place, all the way through to the 5, where it's fully embedded and developed at an exemplary level, with a culture of continuous improvement and good evidence on outcomes and impacts. And the sector was invited to use that guidance to assess themselves. And clearly, this was a big kind of adventure and a little bit uncertain. You know, some people I think felt, oh, is this just asking the sector to mark their own homework? Will we get robust data back? Others recognizing that actually it was a wonderful invitation for us to be reflective and robust in our kind of professional practice. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happened as a result of all of that. I think finally, in terms of the design of the KEF, it's just worth saying that clustering of universities and HEIs was built in from the start. This idea that it's pointless comparing very different kinds of universities. And this diagram sort of represents 7 clusters that were consulted upon and settled upon, ranging from cluster E, large broad-based universities, through to the arts and the STEM specialist institutions. And that's allowed, I think, for a more intelligent kind of sharing of the results. And how are the results shared? There's a KEF dashboard, and we'll pop you can just search for KEF dashboard and find this. And for each institution, what you will get is this sort of pie diagram, and the 7 perspectives arranged around the outside. The sort of dark blue line running sort of around, sort of roughly halfway across, is the cluster average, and then the pies are filled with where that institution performed and where they were in relation to their peers. You can also access the wonderfully rich and interesting narratives that sat behind those scores. So that's how you get hold of the KEF.
We've done two reviews, and the first review was looking very much at some top level findings from the KEF research, and then the recent review that we've just recently published. So how well did the KEF work? How well did it work in terms of representing a differentiated picture of ATI support for public and community engagement? And I think there was some nervousness that, you know, that institutions were using self-scoring themselves. So actually, would everybody choose to be in the middle ground? So did the scores reflect this differentiated picture? And what we found is that actually, institutions scored themselves from 9 to 24 using quite a large kind of number of the potential scores available. And so this gave us some hope that actually people were really thinking hard about where they were really supporting engagement well and where they might want to improve. The second thing we wanted to know was, did universities use a full range of scores? Did many people score themselves a 1? Did many score themselves a 5 to assess their performance? And here I think you probably see quite a lot of people using the middle ground, the 3s, quite a few using the 3s and the 4s. Only one institution choosing to score themselves with a 1 for one of their criteria, and then a few 5s. And I think that it was interesting to see how many actually scored themselves, just used all of the same score for each of the 5 areas, and how many used it more than one score. And the majority used either the same score for every of the 5 areas, or just a score difference of around 1. And so we found that quite interesting, just to see how people were making sense of how they supported engagement. Paul's going to talk a little bit about how we viewed how realistic those scores were, based on the evidence provided in the KEF returns. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sophie. So yeah, this was something Research England wanted our kind of expert advice about, was looking at the evidence submitted. What did we think in terms of how realistic those scores were in relation to the evidence submitted? So we were just looking at what was in the narratives, not using our knowledge of those institutions. And we applied a frame to help us do this. We looked at a sample of the narratives, and what we were looking for is, in our opinion, was it a realistic score, which sits in the middle, set against the guidance and the expectations in the guidance? Over on the left, did we feel actually people were being quite modest in relation to that guidance and in relation to their peers, or were they being actually really very tough and really marking themselves hard? On the other extreme, being more generous, were they positive as opposed to modest, so giving themselves the benefit of the doubt, or were they generous, really significantly bigging up the judgment in relation to that evidence? And we also identified a few which we called outliers, who basically just interpreted the guidance in ways that didn't quite make sense to us, trying to look at it retrospectively. And as a result of that, and as a result of looking at that sample, here are 3 possible outcomes. On the left, what I think people feared, that this was marking our own homework. We were all going to score very generously. The second, B, where actually the bulk of the responses were what you might call realistic, with some shifting a bit to low, some shifting a bit generous. Or C, are we a really hair shirt sort of sector who really mark ourselves really, really hard? And in terms of which it actually was, to take you out of your suspense, it was actually the one in the middle. We felt genuinely that people had been realistic, and they had made a really sort of fair assessment in the majority of cases. Of course, there were outliers, and there were those that weren't that, but that was how it came across to us. And sort of finally, what we also did at this point was just share a few reflections about how we thought the process could be improved. Having spent quite a lot of time looking at all of those narratives, we felt that the criteria could have been clearer. It could have been easier for people to really be able to benchmark themselves if those criteria, the sort of indicators that were set in the guidance, were a little bit more robust and clear. We felt it was a really tough process without moderation. Because people weren't brought together to compare and contrast, it was hard for them to build that collective understanding. And so it's a miracle in some ways that it was as good as it was. We felt that those narratives that did return some data, for instance, giving detail of the resources they'd invested, being able to give some quite robust quantitative evidence, that was helpful. So, and having some clear shared indicators that could be used by everybody and compared more robustly. And we also felt, and we'll pick up on this over the course of the day, that there could have been more useful intelligence about evaluation. The last two sections that we'll talk about later didn't give us as much kind of traction and insight as we'd hoped. So there you go. That was our first stab at working through the narratives. And I'll hand back to Sophie to tell you about what we've just finished.
Great, thanks Paul. And we're just going to do a very quick introduction to this before we go off to our watch parties, and then we're going to come back and do much more deep dive. So the public and community engagement in the KEF thematic review is a piece of work we've just undertaken. It was conducted by me and Paul, but particularly by Emma Griffin, who is a key researcher on the project and who has just had a little baby, Mabel, so isn't able to join us, is wanting to spend much more time with Mabel than with the KEF, which I'm not that surprised about. But I just want to acknowledge her work working with Paul and I on this review. And so how did we approach this? We coded each of the narrative statements in NVivo, which is a data management tool for analysis. We then developed a framework which included specific questions that we wanted to ask of that data. And then we approached that by doing some high-level text searches and deeper inquiries through full read-throughs. So a lot of the work originally was the text searches, but then we wanted to really get the texture of the data, and so we did end up reading quite a lot of the data, the narrative statements, in order to inform our conclusions. We developed search terms which we ran on some of the statement sections, and those are outlined in the report. And the activity and the summary sections, we actually did read-throughs to do the coding, because actually it was really challenging to get the nuance of all the data that people were providing in those. We then worked through those existing those questions within the framework and captured all the findings into the report. And we did find that there weren't, some of the questions we posed, there just wasn't enough data to answer them really effectively. So there were 4 focal points for our research. The first was on the purpose and practices of public engagement and how HEIs were making sense of that, how they described it, the kinds of activities they did, how they related it to place, and which publics and communities people were choosing to engage with. And we were particularly interested in to what extent the work that was being cited in the returns was knowledge-based, so how it related to knowledge. The second area was how HEI support engagement, so how they organise themselves to deliver public and community engagement and the resources that they allocate to it and the funding they draw on to support it. The third one is how HEIs were making sense of the impacts of their public and community engagement work and how they monitored and evaluated those impacts. And the final questions that we were looking at was the wider context for public engagement and how the KEF narratives, what the KEF narratives told us about public and community engagement in the sector. And what are the key areas of reflection based on the KEF narratives? And we'll be exploring that later. So what are our headlines? Well, the heartening thing was that we believe that, having done all this analysis, that public and community engagement is in robust health, and there are a diversity of approaches across the sector. And there's, it was a real privilege doing this research, because I think that we got to see some of the real strengths in the sector and the kinds of commitments that public and HEIs were making to public and community engagement. Perhaps not surprisingly, the dominant mode of engagement was to inspire and inform the public, and indeed around 80% of all the kind of activities cited within the returns really focused on that inspire and inform, and that's a critical part of the public engagement landscape. But we're also heartened to see other forms of public engagement, perhaps more collaborative methodologies, more co-created methodologies working in partnership with communities locally, also shine through. There was a real dominance of a local or regional focus to the work. So 65 of the 117 institutions that completed KEF returns framed their public and community engagement through a civic, place-based or anchor narrative. And interestingly, they aim to, many of them aim to integrate their public and community engagement with this holistic approach to place-based working. And we found it quite interesting that people are thinking a bit more holistically about their public and community engagement footprint. And one of the findings linked to just who they were partnering to do that, and businesses were featuring much more strongly than perhaps they had done in the past. There was a really strong commitment to inclusive practice, and a lot of ATIs referencing their concern to address inequalities in society, and prioritizing marginalized groups and folding them into the kinds of engagement work that they were trying to prioritize and do. I guess that there was a real challenge around monitoring and evaluating the work in this area, both at a strategic level and at a project-based level. And a lot of HEIs were reflecting that they really wanted to improve this. And when we drill down to that later, we'll be able to give you some of the examples of how it is. Do a much deeper dive into the thematic review that we've just undertaken. So first we're going to look at the purpose and the practice of public engagement, and in this section we were looking very much at the kinds of activities that universities foreground or HEIs foreground, how they described and framed their approach to public and community engagement and their purposes for supporting it, how they relate public and community engagement work to place, if indeed they do, and which publics or communities they work with or they prioritize. And of course the KEF returns are only a partial kind of a view on what universities are doing, but I think they provided a real sense of how universities were making sense of their public and community engagement work. So the typical activities we grouped into 4 different categories, and we were really interested in how the activities that universities were doing linked into how they were knowledge based, or how they related to knowledge. And what we discovered, there were kind of 3 main areas: 2 that were predominantly disseminative, inspiring, informing forms of engagement, and they were the sharing knowledge. So like having exhibitions and festivals and open days and outreach in schools tended to be more event-based activity. And then the second was kind of providing access to knowledge, which tended to be not so time-bound. So perhaps providing resources or creating publications or archives and collections that people could engage with over time, and had less involvement of kind of immediate staff, being involved at the point of access that the public were making. The second kind of the third area was this idea of building knowledge together, and this was much more the collaboration with communities, that they might be using art-based methods, they might be doing participatory research methodologies, they might have been working with community or peer researchers, and you see a lot more sense of kind of co-creation and collaborative approaches in the building knowledge together. And then there was this kind of 4th section, which was all about universities being a good neighbour. And in part, I think this was particularly because of universities' endeavours to address the impact of COVID-19 on their local place or on their local communities, and some of the many brilliant things that universities were involved in to try and work alongside communities to address some of those outcomes. And we saw quite a few references to things like volunteering of students and staff, or providing access to facilities, another critical part that universities were doing in terms of making access to their place more achievable. And when you look at these kinds of activities, it's interesting to think about, well, how many, of the activities that were listed, and we categorized them in those ways, what was the percentage of each. And so about 74% of the activities cited that we explored were about sharing knowledge. So the more event-based types of activity, obviously are often quite large events and open days that people were citing. About 5% were providing access to knowledge, which gives around 79% being the kind of inspiring, informing, the inspiring and informing aspects of engagement. 7% of activities were talking about building knowledge together. And there were some really thoughtful examples, particularly around community engagement, that were illustrated within the activities listed, and quite a breadth and depth of types of activity. And then about 14% of the activities that were included within the returns were about being a good neighbour, and were much more cited, not so much around the research or the knowledge that the university was working with, but much more about being a good neighbour as a big organisation in a specific place. So lots of well, not lots, but quite a few of the KEF returns included infographics, and the infographics served a really useful purpose in reducing the kind of words that you needed to describe things, but also capturing some really good thinking. And this is an example from Wolverhampton, and for those of you who didn't join Mary earlier, then do catch the video that Mary made and learn more about their approach to the KEF. And this is a kind of a really nice way of thinking about the place-based model of public and community engagement, looking at the transformational change at the heart, and then thinking about how that works with people within the university and the communities and publics. This second example is from the University of Birmingham. I don't know if we have anybody from the University of Birmingham here today, and do shout up if you do. But this is quite an interesting, I mean, the University of Birmingham used a lot of infographics in their return, and they were really trying to help make sense of the different natures of the relationship and the activities that they did with publics. And this diagram relates to the Exchange, which is a new space that they are occupying in the city, and how they understand the ways that they're going to engage publics within it. So you've got the kind of the engaging encounters, which is their exhibitions, events and workshops. You've got the engaged research, which is the collaborative research for inclusive growth. And interestingly, quite a lot of returns that were looking at those collaborations with publics and with businesses were thinking about the inclusive research agenda. And we will be sharing these slides so you can really explore them more fully later. So what about the geographical focus? And the geographical focus, perhaps not surprisingly, 91% of the ATIs cited a local focus in their IC and P&C statements. And I think that it perhaps isn't that surprising. There's been a huge amount of focal point around universities being in a specific place, and a whole load of agendas around place-based engagement and the civic university agenda. 74% referenced regional engagement, around 59% national, and around 56% international. And I guess that it really struck us that this civic and place-based policy drivers that are driving people's behaviour is really causing universities to really reflect on how they engage in their place and the role of their knowledge exchange activity in that engagement. So going to the next slide, what are the purposes and practices of public engagement? And we looked at how ATIs talk about their activities and thinking about which policy framings universities refer to. And although we found around 10 different framings, we're just going to focus on the ones that were perhaps more prevalent. And we're going to group together civic, local anchor, and place-based and levelling up, because these were the ones that were really prevalent within the ways that ATIs were making sense of things. So around 65 of the 117 institutions framed their public and community engagement through a civic, place-based or anchor narrative, and many aim to integrate their public and community engagement within a holistic approach to working in their space, drawing connections, for example, between their business engagement and public engagement with a goal of generating inclusive economic development, as I mentioned earlier. perhaps it's not surprising that this civic focus was a real kind of dominant kind of trend in the data. And a lot of universities reference civic university agreements, but it was really early days. So they were very new, with many universities talking about that they were wanting to set up those to set up those civic university agreements, but actually many hadn't yet done so, but they were in the planning process of doing that. And I think there was a sense about a real desire to engage publics and communities in the governance of the institutions. So quite a few references to how to make sense of that. I guess this civic focus also aligned with the term being a local anchor university, and a local anchor that focused on the awareness of the position of the HEIs have in their region, locally and regionally. And also the fact that they have a convening power and can contribute to change, and that there's a real responsibility, but also the understanding how to manage that responsibility within the context of their space. In terms of the place-based framings that you find lower down, with only 20 using that specific kind of framings, that was a lot about strategies and policies and partnerships that were about responding to local challenges and working with local communities. So trying to really understand the needs and the interests and the opportunities with local communities and responding to their local context by engaging in thoughtful ways with that. We had quite a conversation in the research team about the levelling up agenda and the fact that only four institutions chose to reference that, and they were all focused on the role of levelling up in the future institutional activity. So that real sense of that they wanted to address some of the issues locally in order to encourage more more levelling up, the levelling up agenda. Moving on, here's an example from UWE, one of the hosts of the NCCPE, and this is how they're making sense of their engaged university footprint and the different aspects of engagement that contribute to that. And they really want to clarify the relationship between business engagement, public and community engagement, cultural and sports engagement, civic engagement, and learning engagement, and how they work together. And they engage in a whole load of work in the west of England, really trying to think hard about how to make a positive difference and to learn from the place that they're in. I guess that one of the things that comes up again and again is how businesses are referenced, and in a moment I'm going to explore that. That why is it that when we're talking about public and community engagement, people are often referencing business engagement, and we think in part that's been afforded by the fact that people are beginning to make a much more holistic attempt to understand their engagement footprint and their relationship with their place. And that actually by understanding the interconnectivity between all these different aspects of their work, rather than just focusing on business engagement or just focusing on public engagement, there's a real richness that comes from that. So here's an example from the Arts University Bournemouth. They say they're a creative community dedicated to working with our local creative and business community in the development of the arts, skills and access to experience. As a specialist art and design institution, we believe in power of creative experiences and see our role as an anchor of place to contribute to the cultural life of the region and support the social and economic well-being of the community. And I'm aware that some people are adding comments. I'm not reading them now. I'm going to come to at the end because I can't multitask, so I'm afraid. Okay, so we talked earlier about this definitional kind of challenge around what do we mean by public engagement, what do we mean by community civic engagement, and where do different HEIs put their emphasis? And so it's quite interesting that for some, when they were reflecting on their public engagement footprint, they see it as a priority strand of their knowledge exchange activity and is closely linked to evolving sets of policies and practices that specifically focus on public engagement with research. And so here's an example from Cranfield. Cranfield University is a specialist institution which combines a deep understanding of technology, entrepreneurship and leadership training. Cranfield actively champions public engagement with STEM subjects by using its facilities, knowledge and training. On the other hand, there were some HEIs who are making a much more focus on the community civic engagement, where public and community engagement was woven into this place-based approach to knowledge exchange. And I guess that this framing drew much more on the traditions of community and civic engagement and tends to encompass a broader range of practice and approaches than the public engagement with research lens. And Coventry University Group has a distinguished history working locally, nationally and internationally to embed collaboration and maximise results with and for partners. Local growth and community engagement are focused on the core needs of local citizens, health inequalities, unemployment, and developing holistic and targeted community support for longer term societal advancement and inclusive growth. So another really good example of how these different kind of lenses or emphases were played out. The second kind of different kind of emphasis that we found were those that were public engagement emphasis of focusing on improving and increasing interaction with communities compared to the public benefit emphasis, which focused on delivering benefits for communities. And again, this is a spectrum. There are different people with different HEIs with different emphasis, but these were kind of two kind of clear kind of narrative emphasis that arose. So, for example, with the University of Manchester, thinking about focusing on improving and increasing interaction with communities, they said, I think, Deanne, you're here, the University of Manchester, we contribute to knowledge exchange across the full range of our core objectives of excellence and impact in research, teaching and social responsibility, including through involving the public and our community in our work via our award-winning cultural institutions. And then on the other side, this kind of focus on public delivering benefits for communities, Northumbria University saying strong civic bonds are a key component to an economically inclusive and socially mobile society. This approach trusts academics to contribute to the community through working with entrepreneurs, practitioners, employers, third sector, public institutions, and individuals. Okay, so my final comments on this section is thinking about who HEIs are partnering with, who they're working with, and the references in the narratives to these different types of organisation. And not surprisingly, perhaps schools featured really highly in people's returns. A lot of people doing a lot of effective work engaging with schools, but then I think we were slightly more interested or surprised by how prevalent businesses were referenced. And as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to make sense of why that was. And I think that policy and funding has traditionally funded business engagement as separate to another to public and community engagement. But this new focus on place seems to be really encouraging universities to talk about their businesses and traditional public and communities as being partners in the kind of more holistic ecosystem. So I think that that's been really interesting. I'm going to move on quickly because I appreciate I've probably taken quite some time. We've got a lot to get through, and I also want to get to the discussion that's happening. But here's a kind of graph that illustrates the kinds of publics that HEIs work with. So we've looked at the partners that they're working with, but who are the publics they're working with? In this, teachers obviously featured quite highly, not surprisingly, with the partnerships with schools, but there was also quite a big focus on marginalised groups and lots of different languages used to describe that. I don't think we have yet got a sophisticated language to describe who we mean by marginalised groups, but there's a real sense that inclusion and being aware of those who aren't currently engaged with through the opportunities that universities provide was something that was a real kind of preoccupation with a lot of the HEIs that were working together. And here's just one example of one of the infographics, again back from University of Wolverhampton, showing how they're making sense of their internal and external public and communities. I'm thinking really hard about everybody who's involved in their work. And just going to a closer view, because I'm sure you can't easily see this, but you can see that around the outside of this, like the NHS, MPs, LEPs, local government, heritage and cultural organisations, but then also remembering the internal kind of partners who are part of this agenda, including staff and volunteers and ambassadors and staff unions and student unions and service providers and contractors. And so just really quite a nice graphic to help capture the breadth and depth of people engaged. That's brought me to an end to this section. So before we move on to how HEIs support public engagement, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who hopefully has been keeping up with the chat and can reflect on some of the questions there.
Yes, the chat has been buzzing and really thoughtful, interesting comments and reflections on it. And Alexa, you picked up quite early on as Sophie was talking about, actually one of the things you loved about the KEF is that actually there isn't a gold standard on how to do it. There is an encouragement for the diversity of practices to be celebrated, because perhaps because the narrative itself invited that. If there'd just been one or two very sort of precise metrics, that would have perhaps driven a much less kind of, I guess, interesting and expansive range of approaches. So I thought that was a really nice conversation. People were reflecting a little on the levelling up. I think we need to remember people were writing these narratives a long time ago, and so levelling up perhaps didn't have quite such a traction. I think I seem to remember back in those days people were talking about left behind places more, but I think Matthew and others were just reflecting on the levelling up perhaps being a bit of a fad, whereas the place and the anchor and the civic perhaps having a bit more longevity for people to hook onto, and Rachel emphasised that. Yeah, I think Nat makes a very interesting reflection, though. Yes, it's great, isn't it, that people can be encouraged to reflect a diversity of approaches, but does that then put pressure on universities to try and do a bit of everything? And actually, that, I think what was so lovely when we were doing those case study interviews with people was really understanding the distinctiveness of those different universities and how confident and how focused they were on doing it their way, rather than trying to emulate others or do lots of different bites at engagement. They were full-blooded in the approach they took, which I loved. Laura triggers a really interesting conversation about encouraging her colleagues and her sort of senior peers at UCL to be humble and honest in the approach, and that actually that would be very much more beneficial longer term, and actually managing to persuade people of that. But at the same time, I think that isn't the way universities often like to be positioning themselves, particularly when there's money attached. And I think the beauty of the KEF, perhaps as well as it being quite an open narrative, is that also currently it isn't attached to funding, which allows, I think, perhaps for a more reflective approach. So, Sophie, those were just some of the themes that came through. And I can't
Yeah,
keep up
I was just
because it's buzzing.
noticing people are now talking about the fact that for many, widening participation isn't relevant to their CAF return. It
Mm,
isn't included in HABSCIS, so actually, that they didn't include schools at all. And I think what was
mm,
interesting is the diversity of types of schools engagement that was included, from the kind of the more researcher engagement with schools type of activity that
mm,
for example the universities like Southampton are doing, and then the kind of the widening to participation kind of activity that perhaps isn't so focused on being knowledge based in its focal point. So I think that was a really interesting
mm.
reflection, and something that we could probably drill down to in more depth.
Yeah. Yeah, and right back at
Mm.
the beginning, Bryce asked about, did the focus on the local rather than the international benefit HEIs in the KEF? And I hope, Bryce, that we've sort of partly answered that by just sort of reflecting on the fact that actually go full throttle local, or actually position yourself much more operating more with a regional and an international focus, and that's fine within the KEF. You weren't punished, I hope, for either. So, and I think that was the spirit of Alexa's response to that, which is actually we were allowed to let the distinctive approaches speak. But again, I think just to emphasize what Sophie was saying earlier about the place focus, how strongly that did seem to push through and really anchor the narratives. So should we just take a quick look at the second area, which was much more about the kind of mechanics of the support for public and community engagement. And we were looking at the infrastructure, but we were also looking at the resources that they had at their disposal. I think the first thing to say is, in terms of the support, it kind of looked two ways. We had the support that was very inward focused, which was very much about getting the mechanics of the support within the HEI working well. So that's the one on the right, that sort of purple inward facing. So that was a host of things, whether that was collecting data, delivering training, connecting staff to evaluation support, etc. And there were also a range of activities that were very much about looking out and being, a welcoming door and a kind of broker of relationships to the outside world. So coordinating events, managing relationships with local communities, etc. And then we looked at how do people get themselves together to make that kind of work happen. And sitting on the left of this slide, there are three approaches that emerged sort of fairly consistently when we looked at the data. And there were 64 of the 117 HEIs who actually were sort of relatively precise about this. 31 of those used the middle one, public and community engagement expertise sitting within a sort of wider KE team. Around, I think it was about 23 had actually invested in a public engagement team itself. It had a specialist public engagement team. And we found around 10 who had a sort of had a dispersed approach with that support sort of spread across the institution and embedded into different departments and research centres. So that was interesting to see. What we also managed to derive from the data was some typical processes that were being managed, and those of you who've worked with us for many years will recognize many of these from our Edge self-assessment tool. A real focus on learning, supporting learning, training and professional development. A lot of work to support staff and students through things like seed funding, support for bid writing and development, internal public engagement networks, etc. I think the point we were making earlier about King's approach that Stephen talks about so eloquently is a particular focus at King's on that second point there, that support for bid writing. There was a lot of work around sort of involving publics in governance roles, providing access points, and also the kinds of reward and recognition activity. But you know, our hearts always used to sing when people gave really concrete examples. And personally, I love diagrams, and this was just this jumped off the page for me. This was the University of Kent, who, talking about their reward and recognition, provide a very concrete example of how it's now embedded, integrated into their working culture, included in every grade of their academic career map, and the framework sets out their expectations. And you know, this is one of the beauties of the KEF, I think, is that we can move this kind of practice, these examples around us as people who are kind of professionally interested in how to do this work well. This is another example, another infographic, and I do find infographics very helpful. They do save words, as Sophie says, but they also speak, I think, quite clearly. Birmingham has invested a very significant amount of resource into its support. It explains it. It's got a leadership team. It's got a public engagement team centrally. It's got academic governance, external relations, and professional services sort of working in a kind of integrated and joined up way. And they detailed the actual amount of full-time roles that were dedicated to it. And I think it was a very tangible and very easy to understand investment. But I think, you know, it reflects the fact that Birmingham over many years has developed a very sort of sustained investment into public engagement, particularly with research, and has drawn down quite a lot of funding to enable that to happen. I think in others, it was a much more dispersed approach, and so harder perhaps to represent in this sort of way. This is just another example to quickly share. The University of Exeter, who explain how they've organized themselves. But you can imagine, you know, for people reading these narratives, when you get a kind of clear organogram like this, it is very, very persuasive and convincing about actually what is being done practically to make this work happen. Brighton is the third example, who actually don't have a central public engagement team, but they do have a range of different teams, all working with common purpose around their mission, which they call practical wisdom, bringing knowledge to life to do good things in the world. Part of that is their community university partnership program, but that's just one of 5 teams that are working around their engagement agenda. And again, an organogram helps to understand that. I'm going to briefly reflect on what data there was about where the money comes from. to support this. And I think the point really is that this is the best we could do to extract intelligence from the narratives, because people were quite random in what they told you about what funding they drew on and how they actually paid for the work. It was very hard to draw really robust conclusions because you weren't sure really if they were telling you everything. Lots of people didn't tell you anything. And so actually this is one of the things looking forward. It would be very useful to understand more about how this work is actually being resourced and what sources, external funding, philanthropy, higher education innovation funding, research council income, etc. So it was interesting, but it was very hard to be conclusive about what that tells us. This, in contrast, was very easy to grasp, and this was an example of a university who actually told how much they were investing in those different centres and how many staff they had in them and what the key programs and initiatives were. And again, this was really very graspable, and really helped to give a practical kind of demonstration of what's happening at that university. Finally, just some brief reflections on partnership working. And we've talked about that a little in the first section, but what we've found in terms of how universities were supporting partnerships, two broad categories: activity-specific partnerships, and many of you in the room will be very, very familiar with this, but developing particular relationships with communities around a particular kind of research challenge, or around a particular sort of local need, providing consultancy, working with cultural organizations, but really brokering and nurturing very practical project-oriented partnerships. On the other side, much more about involving partners in supporting the university's public and community engagement strategies through things like advisory groups, representation of publics and communities on steering groups, etc. So really trying to bring external wisdom and expertise into the university's own strategic and operational planning of the work that they do. And just finally, again, because I do love a good diagram, I mean, I was surprised at how few universities gave you a bird's eye view of their priority partnerships, but Kent provided this simple but very helpful bird's eye view of their key prioritized partnerships. And that again was something very helpful in really understanding the reach and the focus of the work that they do. So I will pause at that point. And Sophie, I don't know whether there's
there were a couple of comments on the chat about, Kelly asking, do we know if the institutions that had more dispersed PE teams fared better or differently to those with centralised teams? And then Ale asking, well, I wonder if any analysis has been done around public and community engaged full-time equivalents and their KEF returns or success. And I think that there are a couple of reflections that I might proffer on that. I think we haven't done an analysis that looks at those, how did they self-score compared to how many centralized or dispersed resource they had. But I think that, we could do that, but I think that from our work with universities in the sector, that it's much more about understanding the strategic purpose of how you're staffing and resourcing engagement, and actually finding a model that works well with the kind of the lie of your institution. So Paul referenced Brighton's dispersed model enables them to develop really thoughtful engagement that really speaks to their strategic approach to supporting public and community engagement as part of their knowledge exchange activity. Whereas those perhaps with centralised teams, there are lots of examples. Laura Cream here from UCL, who have both centralised and dispersed teams that are doing. They perhaps have a different approach to supporting it, but it's equally effective and it works well with the grain of their institution. So it would be interesting to hear from people in the room their reflections on, is it centralized or is it dispersed or a mixture of two, and how that's working for you. I think that question, what about full-time equivalence? We ask that as part of our watermark assessment process, and those who've been on the watermark process with us, institutions find it really, really hard to find out what that is, because so many staff so many institutions have it as a small part of some people's roles, or it's embedded into roles in different ways. So often that's a really challenging question to ask. So I'd love to hear some reflections in the chat about how it's working in your context. And Paul, I don't know if you have anything you want to reference about it.
Yeah, I think what this left us feeling is actually it was great that people were given the freedom to roam in the narratives and to tell their story. There was some guidance that kind of helped, but trying to then extract from those narratives really kind of robust data that really helps us collectively understand how we're working, what is and isn't working. It just wasn't, there wasn't enough commonality across them to allow you to draw those sort of really intelligent conclusions. And so something that we're not going to talk about in detail today, it comes right at the end of our report, where we suggest there might be some collective indicators that we all feel, if we all use these, then it would enable us to still represent the diversity of approaches, but also be a little bit more consistent and coherent in how we share data with each other and with policymakers. So that certainly is a follow-up conversation to today, which is, could we develop a more robust set of indicators to help us with the next iteration of the KEF, so that we can answer some of those really interesting questions about, so how does it compare if you do this with that? We'd love to be able to do that, but it was very hard to do it with the data that we had.
Yeah, and Sarah makes a really good point that both that they would struggle to put a figure on their FTE, but also we need to be realistic about the different levels of resourcing available within institutions. And so a direct comparison isn't actually that helpful and is probably detrimental to what the KEF is trying to achieve. I added that extra bit on, Sarah. I hope that's all right. Well, if there are no more comments, I'll move on just to talk about making a difference. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a bit passionate about the strategic use of evaluation. And so the making a difference section, looking at how HEIs define the impacts of their public and community engagement, and also how they monitor and evaluate these impacts, was particularly interesting. So what are our key findings in this session? And on the right hand side of my slide, I've got this average score per aspect, and we've averaged across the 117 narratives for each aspect. And you'll see that for results and learning and acting on results, the average score is 3 and just below 3, whereas for the others it's 3.5 or above 3.5. And the reason we reference that is that it showed perhaps a less confidence in the work that was being done around these aspects of results and learning and the acting on results. And what we discovered when we looked at the narratives was that monitoring and evaluation were definitely a work in progress, and HERs are really grappling with how to support this well. We wanted to look specifically at results and learning and acting on results, but actually information about how people are evaluating and monitoring their work was often scattered across the narratives. It was really hard to find what we were looking for. Now, in part, that's because some of the things we were looking for weren't evidenced anywhere in the narratives, or they were found in different pockets as people were trying to help communicate the sense that they were making of their work. And so we were inferring things in some places. So we went back to just looking at what the data really told us. There were two broad focal points for the evaluative work that people were talking about. One that I termed strategic evaluation, that looked to evaluate the effectiveness of the institutional strategy and support. And the second kind of big focal point was this project evaluation, which monitored and evaluated specific engagement activities and programs. And both were evidenced in some of the narratives, and some narratives only evidenced one or the other. Interestingly, although some evaluative data was provided in the narratives, very few HEIs linked that back to their overarching strategic goals. And in part, that was because they didn't have enough evidence to do that, or perhaps this was something they were planning to do in the future but hadn't yet done. And the final thing I think is worth saying is that, and there are reasons behind this, not least because of how, for example, HEPKIS collects data, but in evaluating their activities, HEIs really relied on collecting their kind of like basic monitoring data, like in attendee numbers at events. So a lot of institutions sharing the attendee numbers at events, often because they had them, and sometimes to show a progression of increasing the diversity of participation in certain events that they were running. So what were the broad approaches taken? And this list of approaches, it's fair to say that lots of HEIs use one or more of these approaches, so they're not mutually exclusive. but there was quite a few HEIs who referenced that they really wanted to develop evaluation that was appropriate to individual projects and address the aims of the intervention, and that they either put support in place to do that or they encouraged their staff to do that. And obviously that's a really critical part of being thoughtful about evaluation, is to ensure that when you're evaluating a project that you have the skills needed to evaluate that appropriately. The second, as I mentioned earlier, was the sense that they evaluate the support for public and community engagement and seek to do that often against things like the EDGE tool. Some people went through the watermark process. Some people have external consultants who come and work with them to help them do that. Others have kind of ways of indicating how their support is working out. And yes, quite a few referencing the EDGE tool. The HEI intended to carry out future evaluation. A significant of institutions reflected that they recognised their need to up their game around evaluation and learning and being really thoughtful about how they did that, and that they were going to build that into their programmes in the future. There were a small number of HEIs who had a clear strategic approach to evaluation across all of their work, and they integrated it in really thoughtful ways. There was a small number of HEIs who only used monitoring data to evidence impact, and this heavy reliance on monitoring data was felt across the whole KEF. There were lots and lots of numbers of attendee numbers. Also, numbers of partners people engaged with, so how many partners that they had managed to achieve to engage with over a period of time. Many of the institutions, and this was quite interesting, I think, in terms of being able to understand what was going on, chose to reference the partnership work they were involved in and how much their work was informed by these partners. So it wasn't a typical evaluation data, but it was definitely reflecting on how they were learning from their partners and trying to adapt their processes in light of that learning. And there were a few references to how they did that. And then several institutions didn't reference any evaluation methodologies in the KEF, for some because they just hadn't developed an approach at all, or others because they wanted to share their high-level commitment to the process and then didn't want to use their words to describe what that actually meant in practice. So there was a kind of, both ends of the spectrum, if you like, of those who saw it as such a strategic priority, they just said it was, and then those who didn't have any much to say about it. We then looked to how people were exploring making a difference from their public and community engagement. How did they define that impact, or how do they monitor and evaluate those impacts? And we chose to look in the results and learning session, but we found very little detailed accounts of impact. But we did find a number of impact categories, and those are listed on the slide. So improved lives of individuals, 11 institutions referenced, furthered health research from 9, tackled inequality from 8, influenced policy from 7. And these are really low numbers, I think. And in part, I think that's because quite a lot of the impact generated through the activities and the like was often a link off. So you had to leave the narrative and go to a new place to read more detailed account. And the number of words just wasn't sufficient to enable people to evidence this particularly effectively. We did try and see if there was more accounts of impacts elsewhere, but it didn't actually change the nature of what we found in this section. And I guess it made us really think hard about, to what extent, what would a more kind of cohesive results and learning section look like? What would be an optimal section? And we thought that those that seemed to do it well, and that they were few but far between us, that the impacts and the results are evidenced and they link back to the overarching aims and objectives of the strategic approach being taken. And then the narratives actually foreground how the public and community engagements align and support that strategic commitment. We did find in the activity sections richer accounts of impacts generated, and you can see that in the report. We referenced some of those. And so if you want to find out more, I always feel a bit sad when I see this slide, because absolutely lots of the work that is being cited in these returns is having an impact. The next slide basically looks at, well, how are people monitoring this? And again, there isn't a huge amount of detail. The word count was low, so you don't have a lot of words to describe your full evaluative approach. But it was interesting to see how people were making sense of that. So within the results and learning session, around 16 mentioned feedback and satisfaction levels. So quite a lot of people are doing, particularly for those doing event-based activity, having an opportunity to feedback at the point of intervention. Event attendee numbers, KPIs, so people were talking about key performance indicators as part of their assessment. Project monitoring reports were referenced, click-through monitoring, so looking to see, how people progress on to another site or what have you. And then several reference their HEP key monitoring data. And again, quite a low number of HEIs providing this information, giving quite a kind of patchy picture of what's really going on. I guess that the narratives really illustrated that there were these two kind of monitoring approaches. One was the project-based one, and one was the widening institutional monitoring. And I guess that these are really these kinds of this monitoring of public and community engagement. A lot of the examples from this are more on the project-based side. I'm just going to show a couple of examples of some of the stuff that we saw, some more infographics. I think that this is one from Manchester University. So I don't know, Deanna, if you're still with us, but this was they adapted this from a report that they'd written, and they were just trying to capture some of the things that had been achieved both through their strategic work, but also looking at in terms of their engagement. So, for example, their community festival, where they cite that since 2017 they've had 6,448 visitors, and 50% of those are from their local communities. And I think that this is a lovely example that kind of celebrates both their external engagement work but also their internal work. So seven staff are recognised with Queen's Honours Awards. They've had 14 researchers awarded external recognition for outstanding contribution to public engagement by learned societies, and they've had 6% of all entries to their Making a Difference work have been around public engagement. So there's some really nice data in here. This one from the University of Brighton. I mean, the University of Brighton were quite interesting because they set out a really clear strategy for collecting monitoring data and reporting on impacts. And they take quite a dynamic approach to their qualitative and quantitative approaches. Their evaluation framework really encourages staff to embed evaluation in the design and delivery of their projects, and to use a range of conventional and more creative monitoring approaches, some of which are detailed on this slide. And their approach is designed not only to enable the projects to work well and grow and develop as they learn from the approaches they're taking, but also for the institution as a whole to understand the scale of their engagement and also to respond to the needs of partners. And I think that's a real characteristic of Brighton's approach, that they really want to be responsive to partners. And their use of their monitoring and learning evaluation it really wants to promote their learning. And so they had a lot to say in this section. And this slide basically gives a summary of some of their approaches to evaluating their work. Finally, the University of Birmingham, and I guess for those who are looking at the strategic approach and evaluating their strategic approach, quite a few took the University of Birmingham's approach. And the University of Birmingham obviously been through the watermark process. They'd gone through a watermark process several years earlier. They'd come up with an action plan, and then they talked about the actions that they'd taken in order to improve that. And they talked a lot about how they could then measure against that action plan what they'd achieved. And quite a few institutions who chose to look at their strategy did use the EDGE tool or a watermark process to do that. I'm going to bring that to an end. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to reflect on the monitoring and evaluation section. It made me feel that there was a lot that wasn't said. And I'm sure that there was a lot that could have been said that wasn't said just because the word count was low. But it makes me think that it's not surprising that the monitoring and evaluation work perhaps wasn't as sophisticated as some of the other aspects of the work, because it's one of the things that's been a challenge in the sector for a long time.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. And yeah, Nat's sort of comment about, I wonder how much of the reliance on monitoring data is influenced not by the public engagement professionals, but rather, the pressure from senior leadership who tend not to get the nuances of reach, numbers versus significance, the sort of depth. And I think this is a conversation we need to have in relation to the research excellence framework as well, and there is a consultation about that at the moment. So we'll say a little bit about that at the end of the session. And Laura, that comment, sometimes the analysis of our weaknesses is the most useful. It's helping me make arguments internally, so thank you. Yes, yeah, and that was the point of the KEF, I think, was that professional development as a sector. So great. I'm just going to say a few words about the last part of the report. Just one final thing we tried to do was just step right back and just make a few reflections on what this tells us about the wider context. And as part of that, we looked at other narratives that were submitted as part of the KEF. So every institution was invited to write an institutional context, which described their overall approach to knowledge exchange. So we looked at that. They also produced local growth and regeneration narratives that sort of were sister narratives almost to the public and community engagement. So we took a look. And when we looked at the institutional context where the university said, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we care about, we did a word search, just a frequency search, and took out all the unnecessary words. But sitting in the middle, everything you'd expect: students, research, knowledge, world, exchange. That outer ring of black, larger words, I think, really sort of indicated a real sort of sensitivity now to how universities frame their relationship to their region, their communities, and how they engage with it. And we were sort of interested in how that is very much embedded in a sort of sense of people and place. And then we sort of dive down deeper into reading those narratives, those institutional narratives. And about we reckon 82 of them made a quite sort of meaningful reference to the importance of their community connections, their civic and their place anchoring role, their relationships with publics and communities, and a commitment to inclusivity. And I think that would not have been something we would have seen a few years ago. So a real sense of something of a sea change. When we, again, just going back to what Sophie was talking about earlier, about public engagement and community engagement, when we looked at those institutional narratives, some explicitly talked about public and community engagement as a thing. We do it, we do this stuff, we do this practice of engaging. And Cranfield's example that we referenced earlier is a really nice example. Yes, public and community engagement, it's a priority for us. In others, I think it was more about almost community engagement as a mindset and a kind of value proposition almost for the university, that our work is embedded in community and we put publics and communities into close to our hearts, to be a little bit sort of poetic. I think perhaps that's stretching it a bit, but it's that commitment to our place, to our communities, and to inclusivity, etc. And the example on the right, say from the University of Brighton, many universities spoke this language really of being really about bringing together all of their external engagement in a responsive way to really contribute to social and economic good, and to put communities at the heart of their practice. So we were encouraged to see that narrative becoming stronger. We looked briefly across at the local growth and regeneration narratives, and some of them were very explicitly what you might expect, which is economic growth, business, and a very sort of tight focus on that. And that was about 54 of them. And that example from Plymouth on the left is sort of quite typical of that approach, which says, by local growth and regeneration, we mean how we connect to the sort of local economic infrastructure. On the right, I think Sarah's University, Lancaster, a sort of a different kind of narrative, and there were about 63 of these we found, where they were really emphasizing that sort of that community connectedness, and certainly a lot of what came under local growth and regeneration was about economic investment and infrastructure, but guided by a orientation towards their publics and communities. And again, we found that really interesting, and we sensed a really interesting overlap between the two narratives. And Newman University wrote in their return, there's a high level of synergy across our approach to public and community engagement and local growth and regeneration. Last but not least, in terms of how we made sense of public and community engagement, and just going right back to where we started with the fact that there are 7 perspectives in the KEF, and those are down the left-hand side. You could imagine that public and community engagement that sits down here at the bottom is its own kind of world of activity. But actually what we discovered as we read them was that actually public and community engagement was really contributing to a range of other perspectives. And we found it quite helpful to just spell those out. So running down the list in terms of research partnerships, of course, that's very focused on developing relationships with business, with industry, etc. But there's a really strong role for increasing public and community participation in research. In working with business, a real kind of overlap with promoting social innovation and engaging customers and consumers and audiences, developing social enterprise. In relation to the public and third sector, it's real focus on the public sphere, on the role of service users, citizens in shaping public services. In relation to skills, a real focus on human and social capital, on lifelong learning, the story, for instance, that Mary told in her case study. IP and commercialization, we might have thought of it as a kind of very specialist technical economic kind of function, but encouraging open innovation, for instance, a real opening for public and community engagement. And local growth and regeneration, the links to placemaking and to civic responsibility. So I think we thought that is quite interesting and something again to consider as we move into the next phase of KEF.